The alarm started before my eyes were fully open. Not the soft chime of a scheduled alert. Not the system ping I had grown used to during 3 years of deep space patrol. These were the loud, angry alarms that meant something had gone very wrong while I was unconscious, and whatever had gone wrong was still going wrong right now. I pulled myself upright in the pilot seat. My head hurt. My left shoulder hurt worse. The restraint harness had dug into me during the jump, and from the bruising I could already feel forming across my collarbone. The exit from faster-than-light travel had not been gentle. The cockpit lighting had dropped to emergency red. Somewhere behind me, deep in the engineering section, I could hear the low grinding sound of a drive coil that had not survived the trip in one piece. My name is Yara Vasquez. I am a commander in the United Earth Navy, and I had just made the worst navigational calculation of my entire career. I reached forward and silenced the proximity alarms one by one, not because the danger had passed, because I needed to think and I could not think over that sound. The main display flickered twice before it stabilized, and when it did, the image on the screen stopped me cold. A planet. Not just any planet. A large, inhabited planet with a ring of orbital stations so dense they looked like a second set of rings from a distance. Thousands of ships moving in coordinated patterns around it. A communications web so thick my sensors were reading it as almost solid. City lights visible even from this distance, spread across 3 continents in patterns so old and established they had become geography of their own. I recognized it. Every officer in the United Earth Navy was required to study conclave star charts as part of basic strategic training. Not because we were allies, not because we were enemies, because knowing where the most powerful political body in the known galaxy had placed its heart was considered basic professional knowledge, the same way you learn where the nearest hospital is when you move to a new city. I was looking at Orth Prime, the capital of the Galactic Conclave, the seat of the 40-species governing body that had told humanity, 16 years ago, that we were welcome to exist on the edges of their network as provisional observers, that we were not advanced enough, not stable enough, not proven enough to be granted full membership, and that our military vessels were not, under any circumstances, permitted past the buffer zone that separated human-controlled space from conclave territory. The buffer zone I was currently several hundred light-years past. I sat very still for a moment and listened to my own breathing. The ship was the UES Unconditional. She was an Apex-class deep space warship, the 7th generation of human naval engineering, and she was the most advanced vessel Earth had ever built. She was also, at this exact moment, running on 30% shield capacity, with her primary weapons offline, a cracked drive coil, coolant leaking from the port side manifold, and one very tired commander in the pilot seat trying to figure out how this had happened. I knew how it had happened. I had been running from a collision with a dying star's debris field near Kepler's Veil, and the jump I had programmed in the last 4 seconds before impact had been built on guesswork more than mathematics. I had put in a direction and a distance and told the ship to move, and the ship had moved, and this was where we had ended up. The math had been wrong. The jump had been too long. And now I was sitting in orbit above the one place in the galaxy where a human warship had absolutely no business being. I pulled up the passive sensor array and started reading. The stations were already responding. I could see it in the movement patterns of the ships around them. Vessels that had been drifting in slow holding orbits were suddenly moving with purpose, turning toward my position. Communication signals were spiking. The density of outgoing transmissions from the nearest station had tripled in the last 90 seconds. They had seen me. Of course they had seen me. A warship the size of the Unconditional dropping out of faster-than-light travel above your capital planet was not the kind of thing you missed. Our emergence burst alone would have lit up every passive sensor within 1,000,000 kilometers. We had arrived loud, and we had arrived exactly where we were not supposed to be, and the only question now was what happened next. My ship's AI, who I had named Arya 2 years ago during a long patrol when I had run out of other things to do, spoke from the overhead speaker in her calm, even voice. Commander Vasquez, I am detecting 47 vessels changing course toward our position. The nearest is currently at approximately 60,000 kilometers and closing. Estimated intercept time, 11 minutes at current speed. Thank you, Arya. Shall I begin? Evasive calculations. I looked at the display. 47 ships, with a 30% shield and no primary weapons, against 47 ships from a civilization that had been building their military for longer than humanity had been writing things down. No, I said, no evasive calculations. Understood. Shall I begin repair prioritization? Yes, focus on shields first, then communications, then weapons if there is anything left. Understood. Commander, I am also detecting open-frequency broadcasts from Orith Prime Station 1. They appear to be directed at our vessel. I already knew what was coming. I had heard the first edges of it before I silenced the alarms. A voice, not human, carrying the particular quality of sound that meant it was being translated in real time through at least 2 layers of interpretation software. Tight, controlled, but underneath the control, something that sounded very much like fear trying very hard to sound like authority. I turned on the audio feed and let it play. The voice was speaking in the conclave's primary diplomatic language, which Arya translated automatically into English as it came through. The words arrived a half-second after the original sound, slightly mismatched with the rhythm of the alien speech, the way a film looks when the audio is just barely out of sync. Unidentified vessel. You have entered restricted orbital space above Orith Prime without authorization. This is a direct violation of the buffer separation agreement of the 42nd conclave session. You are ordered to identify yourself immediately and hold your current position. Any movement toward the planet or toward conclave stations will be interpreted as a hostile action. Respond. I listened to it twice. Then I turned to my personal log recorder, which I kept running almost constantly during deep space operations. It was a habit I had developed early in my career, not because I thought anyone would read it, because talking helped me think. Log entry, I said. Date is the 14th of March, 2387. Current position is, unexpectedly, Orith Prime, capital system of the Galactic Conclave. How I got here is a story involving poor mathematics and a very aggressive debris field, and I will explain it in full at a later date when I am not actively being hailed by what sounds like a very frightened station controller doing their best impression of someone who is not frightened. I paused. The unconditional is damaged. Shields at 30%. Weapons offline. We are not, in any meaningful military sense, a threat to anyone right now. The 47 ships coming toward us could almost certainly take us apart without significant difficulty if they chose to. The problem is that they do not know that. From where they are sitting, they are looking at an Apex-class human warship sitting in orbit above their capital planet, and nothing in their intelligence files has prepared them for this moment. I glanced at the sensor readings again. The 47 had become 53. More ships peeling away from station holding patterns. The communication spike was getting denser. I need to make a decision, I said into the log. I can go quiet and let them wonder, which will make things worse. I can try to jump out, which I cannot do safely with a cracked drive coil, and which they would probably interpret as the beginning of an attack run anyway. Or I can open a channel and talk. I sat back in my seat. Outside the viewport, Orith Prime hung in the dark like a jewel. It was, genuinely, a beautiful planet. The kind of world that made you understand why a civilization had chosen to place its center of power there. Blue oceans and brown-green continents, and an atmosphere that scattered the light of its sun into soft layers of gold along the Terminator line where day met night. The hail came again, the same voice, still controlled, still trying not to sound afraid. Unidentified vessel. This is your final warning before defensive response protocols are initiated. Identify yourself immediately. I looked at my reflection in the dark edge of the viewport where the glass met the frame. My hair had come loose on one side. There was a bruise forming just below my left eye from when my head had hit the headrest during the jump. My uniform was wrinkled and slightly damp from the cooling fluid that had briefly misted through the air recyclers before Arya had sealed the damaged manifold. I straightened my collar anyway. Some habits you keep regardless of the circumstances. I reached forward and opened a full-spectrum broadcast on every frequency the station had used to hail me, plus the 4 standard diplomatic channels that the Conclave and Earth had maintained, largely symbolically, since the observer agreement was signed. I kept my voice level, calm, the way my first commanding officer had taught me to sound when everything around you was chaos, because in those moments your voice was the only thing you could actually control. This is Commander Yara Vasquez of the United Earth Naval Ship Unconditional. I am broadcasting on all diplomatic frequencies in accordance with Conclave Earth Communications Protocol. I want to be clear about something before anything else happens. This is not an attack. This is not an intentional incursion. I experienced a navigational emergency, and my faster-than-light exit placed me in your orbital space without authorization or intent. I am requesting safe holding position and the opportunity to explain the situation fully. I will not move toward the planet. I will not move toward your stations. I am going to stay exactly where I am, and I am asking, respectfully, for the chance to talk. I released the broadcast button. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the communications board lit up like I had dropped a stone into still water. Arya's voice came back, very calm, counting transmissions as they flooded in. Commander, I am currently reading incoming signals on 41 separate channels. 11 appear to be directed at our vessel. The remaining 30 appear to be internal conclave communications. Shall I filter? Yes, I said. Pull out anything directed at us and cue it. Let the internal traffic run in the background. I want to hear what they are saying to each other. Understood. The internal conclave traffic came through in a cascade of overlapping voices, Arya translating as fast as she could, the different species' languages blurring together at the edges, but the meaning clear enough. A human warship. It is a human warship. How did it get past the buffer? Is it armed? Of course it is armed, they are all armed. Can we confirm weapon status? Where are the others? There must be others. This cannot be a single vessel. Call the full council to emergency session. Do not fire without full council authorization. What if it fires first? It has not fired. It is just sitting there. Why is it just sitting there? I listened to all of it, and for the first time since I had woken up to the alarms, I felt something ease slightly in my chest. Not relief. Not safety, but a kind of clarity. They were afraid of me. Not of what I had done, not of any aggressive action I had taken, because I had not taken any. They were afraid of what I represented. A human warship, sitting quietly in orbit above their most important planet, not attacking, not threatening, simply existing in a place they had decided humans were not allowed to be. And the fact that I was there at all was enough to send 40 species into a panic that no amount of political experience or military protocol was quite managing to contain. I turned back to my log. They are scared, I said quietly. All of them. 53 ships and a full council emergency session, and what they are actually afraid of is the question, not me specifically. The question of what it means that I am here. What it says about how far we have come, what it implies about how much further we might go. I looked at Orth Prime again. I didn't come here to frighten anyone, I said, but I am here, and now we are all going to have to figure out what to do about that. The communications board, was still lit across almost every channel. Outside, the 53 ships had stopped advancing. They were holding position in a wide arc around me, close enough to respond, far enough to wait. Waiting. I started composing what I was going to say next. The first voice that came back to me directly was not what I expected. I had been preparing for military protocol, formal demands delivered in the clipped, official tones of a conclave defense coordinator. What came through instead was a voice that was clearly trying very hard to hide how fast its owner was breathing. There was a slight tremor in it that no amount of translation software could fully smooth out. The words were structured correctly. The authority was there on the surface. But underneath it, barely contained, was something that sounded exactly like a person who had just been told to do a job they were not at all sure they were prepared to do. Commander Vasquez. The name came out careful, like the speaker was handling something fragile. This is Fleet Coordinator Den of the Conclave Defense Authority, Orith Prime Station 1. Your transmission has been received. You are instructed to hold your current position and power down all non-essential systems as a gesture of non-aggression. The full Conclave Security Council has been convened. You will receive further instructions shortly. I noted 3 things immediately. First, they had used my name correctly on the first attempt, which meant someone had already pulled the Observer Agreement files and found my registration, or they had very fast research staff, probably both. Second, they had not asked me to power down weapons, which meant either they already knew my weapons were offline and had no interest in confirming it through negotiation, or someone in that chain of command had made a quiet decision that asking a human warship commander to disarm over an open channel was not a conversation they wanted to have. Third, and most importantly, they had not told me to leave. They could have. The obvious move, if you wanted a ship out of your orbital space, was to tell it to go. Instead, they had told me to hold position and wait for the council, which meant someone, somewhere in that building, had decided this situation was worth trying to manage rather than simply trying to end. I considered that for a moment. Then I pressed the broadcast key. Fleet Coordinator Den. Acknowledged. I am holding position. I want to confirm for your records that my navigational logs are available for independent review if requested. I have nothing to hide regarding how I arrived here, and I am happy to provide full transparency on that matter. I will wait for further contact from the Security Council. Vasquez out. I released the key and turned back to the internal traffic feed. The council session was already underway. Arya was translating in real time, flagging the most significant exchanges and running them in a separate window on the left side of my display. I read through them as they came in, taking notes mentally, building a picture. 40 species in one room was, apparently, not a calm experience under the best circumstances. Under these circumstances, it was a controlled form of chaos that the translation software was struggling to fully capture. Voices overlapping, points of procedure being invoked and dismissed and invoked again. The underlying tension of 40 civilizations that had managed to build a functioning alliance largely by agreeing on rules, and then arguing about everything within those rules, suddenly confronted with a situation that the rules had not quite anticipated. The Veth spoke first in any meaningful sense. I had studied the Veth during my officer training. They were large, deliberate, and they had built their civilization on the principle that strength was the only language the universe truly spoke. They had been the loudest voice against humanity's observer status 16 years ago, arguing that a species with our military history should not be permitted anywhere near conclave space until we had demonstrated a significantly longer period of internal peace. They had been overruled. They had not forgotten it. The Veth Council member's voice came through Arya's translation with a particular kind of heavy certainty. This vessel must be destroyed. The discussion should end there. A human warship above Orth Prime is not a navigational error. It is a demonstration. Whether the commander intends it as such or not is irrelevant. The fact of its presence communicates something to every civilization in this system and every civilization watching from beyond it. If we permit it to remain, we tell the galaxy that human vessels may enter our space without consequence. We cannot permit that message to be sent. A brief silence followed that statement. Then a softer voice, different quality. I did not recognize the species from the sound alone, but Arya tagged it in the translation window as Lyrani. I had read less about the Lyrani than the Veth, but I knew enough. They were one of the oldest species in the Conclave. Small, patient, and possessed of an approach to diplomacy that the other species described variously as wisdom or stubbornness, depending on who you asked. Destroying the vessel solves nothing, the Lyrani voice said. It creates a human crew member killed in conclave space under circumstances that the commander has already placed on open broadcast record. It creates a diplomatic event that we would have to explain to Earth. And it answers none of the questions that actually matter, which are how this ship reached us, what it means about human technological development, and whether our intelligence files on their capabilities are as outdated as this vessel's presence suggests they might be. A louder, multi-species argument broke out around those 2 points. I kept reading. Arya flagged another exchange. This one between 2 council members I could not immediately identify, speaking quickly in an overlapping pattern that suggested they were familiar with each other. The ship is not moving. I see that. It has been holding position for 19 minutes. It has not advanced. It has not powered any offensive systems. If it intended aggression, it has had 19 minutes to act on that intention and has chosen not to. The commander is waiting. Yes, the question is what she is waiting for. She told us what she is waiting for. She is waiting for the council. Another pause. That is either a very confident position or a very desperate one. From what I have just read about human psychology, it might be both simultaneously. I almost smiled at that. I turned back to my personal log. The Veth want to destroy the ship, I said quietly. The Lyrani want to talk. About 38 other species are currently somewhere between those 2 positions, moving back and forth as the debate develops. Standard political physics. 2 poles. Everyone else in orbit around the argument trying to figure out which way the gravity is going to pull. I checked the repair status display. Arya had made progress. Shields were climbing slowly toward 40%. The communications array was fully operational. The weapons were still a problem, which was fine because the weapons were not what I needed right now. What I need right now, I said into the log, is for whoever has the deciding vote in that room to be someone who is more interested in understanding this than in ending it. As if the universe had decided to be briefly cooperative, Arya flagged a new transmission. Not internal council traffic. A direct channel opened on one of the secondary diplomatic frequencies, the kind used for quieter conversations alongside official ones. The voice that came through was different from anything I had heard so far from the conclave. Quieter, more careful with the words, and something in the quality of it, even through the translation layer, suggested someone who had spent a great deal of time listening before they decided to speak. Commander Vasquez, my name is Thessaly. I am the Lyrani ambassador to the Conclave Security Council. I am speaking to you outside official channels because I want to ask you something directly, and I did not want the answer shaped by the formal record. I straightened in my seat. Ambassador Thessaly, I said, go ahead. Were you frightened when you realized where you were? Of all the questions I had been prepared to answer, that was not one of them. I sat with it for a moment. Yes, I said. Why are you still here then? If the jump was an error and your drive coil is damaged, you could have attempted to leave even at reduced capacity. You chose to hold position. Why? I thought about it honestly before I answered. Because running would have looked like guilt, and I have nothing to feel guilty about. I made a navigational error. That is a fact. But I am a commander in the United Earth Navy, and I have been trained to stand in difficult situations and be accountable for them, not to run from them. If I had tried to jump out, you would have read it as aggression or evasion. Either way, it would have made things worse for every human who comes after me. I could not do that. A long silence. Then I believe you. 2 words, very quiet, but the weight behind them was significant enough that I registered it physically, a slight loosening in my shoulders that I had not realized were tensed. The council is going to reach a decision within the next 20 minutes, Thessaly said. I cannot tell you what it will be. The Veth have more support than I would like, but I want you to know that there are voices here arguing that this situation is an opportunity, not a threat. That how we handle it will define something important about what this conclave stands for. I appreciate that, I said. There is one more thing. Your ship, the Unconditional, our files on human naval technology are apparently not current. Several members of the council have been reviewing your sensor profile in the last 30 minutes, and the conversation has been, to use an understatement, significant. I kept my voice level. I see. How advanced is it? I considered my answer carefully, not to deceive, but because the truth required context. Advanced enough to get me here by accident, I said. Not advanced enough to be invincible. She is a warship ambassador. She was built to fight and survive. But right now she is damaged and her commander is asking for a chance to talk, not a chance to demonstrate anything. I would appreciate it if that distinction carried some weight in the room. Another silence, longer this time. It does, Thessaly said at last, with some of us. The channel closed. I sat back and looked at Orth Prime. The light of its sun was shifting as the planet slowly rotated, the gold along the Terminator line deepening toward a warmer orange. Somewhere down there, and on every station around it, 40 civilizations were deciding what to do about me. I checked the internal traffic again. The debate had sharpened into 2 clear camps and the votes were beginning to form. I could not count them precisely from the traffic, but the shape of it was becoming clear. Close. Too close for comfort. Arya spoke again. Commander, I am detecting a shift in the movement patterns of the vessels holding around us. Several are pulling back slightly, not retreating, repositioning. Into an escort pattern. A brief pause as Arya analyzed. Possibly, it is consistent with a holding formation rather than an attack pattern. I nodded slowly. Someone had made a call, maybe not the final one, but someone had decided, at least provisionally, that the next move was not destruction. I opened my log again. 23 minutes in orbit above Orth Prime, I said. No shots fired. No advance made. 53 ships holding position around me like they are not quite sure what to do with me, which is, honestly, the most accurate description of the situation I can offer. The council is still arguing. Thessaly is, apparently, one of the voices in my corner. The Veth are not. I paused. My shields are at 42%. Weapons still offline, drive coils still cracked. If this goes the wrong way, I do not have a great many options available to me. Another pause. But I do not think it is going to go the wrong way. I could not have fully explained why I believed that. It was not based on numbers or tactical analysis or any measurable factor. It was something quieter. A read on the situation built from listening to the fear in those voices, the argument underneath the argument, the 2 council members asking each other why I was still sitting here waiting for the council instead of running. They were trying to understand me. And that, in my experience, was always a better starting point than trying to destroy something. The communications board lit up again. Official channel this time. Arya flagged it as coming from the full council assembly, not a single coordinator. I pressed the receive key. The voice was formal, precise, carrying the particular weight of a decision that had been reached through significant difficulty, and which no one in the room was fully satisfied with. Commander Vasquez of the UES Unconditional, the Galactic Conclave Security Council has convened an emergency session and reached a preliminary determination. You are granted a temporary holding authorization in your current orbital position. You are further granted the right to address the full Conclave Security Council in person, as a formal hearing under the Observer Agreement protocols. This authorization does not constitute acceptance of your presence as lawful under the Buffer Agreement. It constitutes a recognition that the circumstances warrant direct dialogue before any further action is taken. You will be provided with docking coordinates for a shuttle approach to Station 1. You are expected to arrive without weapons, without support personnel, and under the full terms of diplomatic protocol. A beat. Do you accept these terms? I did not hesitate. I accept, I said, and I thank the Council for the opportunity. I closed the channel. Then I sat very still for a moment in the red-lit cockpit of my damaged, drifting, very far from home warship, and I breathed out slowly. Arya, I said, can you plot me a shuttle approach to Station 1? Already calculated, Commander. Of course you have. I pushed myself up from the pilot's seat. I need to change my uniform. The shuttle bay of Station 1 was nothing like I had imagined it. I had imagined something grand. 40 species, each of them older than Earth's written history by varying measures of centuries, coming together under one structure. I had expected scale designed to make the visitor feel the weight of what they were walking into. I had expected ceilings so high they disappeared, walls covered in the symbols and histories of every member civilization. The kind of architecture that says, we have been here a very long time and you have not. What I found instead was a room that was almost exactly the size of a large Earth airport terminal. Clean, certainly. The materials were things I could not have named, surfaces that caught light differently depending on the angle, floor panels, with a slightly warm tone that my eyes kept reading as would even though they clearly were not. The air smelled like nothing at all, which meant the filtration systems were extraordinary, and also meant that 40 species had negotiated a breathable atmosphere that was neutral enough to offend no one, which must have been its own long conversation. But the scale was human, manageable, intentional, I suspected, a choice made to prevent the first physical contact from being immediately overwhelming. There were 6 of them waiting for me. I had not expected to recognize them. I had studied conclave species in the same way I had studied their star charts, enough to function, not enough to be comfortable. But I recognized 2 of them immediately from intelligence files. The tall, broad-shouldered figure at the center was Veth, High Chancellor Arath. He was approximately 2.5 meters tall, with a build that communicated, in a way that required no translation, that his species had not arrived at the top of their food chain through negotiation. His eyes were fixed on me with an expression I could read clearly even across species lines. It was the expression of someone looking at something they do not trust and have decided, ahead of the conversation, that they will not be persuaded to change that view. Beside him, smaller by about a full meter, was the Lyrani figure I was almost certain was Thessaly. The Lyrani looked nothing like any Earth species I could draw a comparison to. Pale, with a kind of stillness about them that reminded me not of any animal I could name but of very old, very deep water. The eyes were large and very dark, and currently watching me with an attention that felt, somehow, like being read. The other 4 were species I could not place from appearance alone. Different sizes, different physical structures, different ways of holding themselves in the slightly unfamiliar gravity of the station. But all of them were watching me, and all of them were doing the same thing Arath was doing, running some version of an assessment, taking measurements, comparing what they saw to whatever file or expectation or fear they had brought into the room with them. I walked to the center of the room and I stopped. I did not bow, not because I was performing arrogance, because I had thought carefully about this on the shuttle over, and I had decided that the first thing humanity's unintentional representative to the galactic conclave did with her body in this room should not be to make herself smaller. I stood straight. I made eye contact with Aerith first, then moved my gaze to Thessaly, then across each of the others in turn. It took about 4 seconds. Then I spoke. Chancellor Aerith, Ambassador Thessaly, thank you for meeting me. I kept my voice exactly the same as it had been over the calm, level, not warm to the point of seeming naive, not formal to the point of seeming defensive. I am aware that my presence here is irregular, and I am grateful for the Council's willingness to hear me before taking any irreversible action. Aerith spoke. His voice, even through the translation, carried that particular heaviness of someone who has spent decades being the largest person in every room he has entered. You are grateful, he said. It was not a question. It had the tone of someone testing a word to see how hollow it was. Yes, I said. A human warship enters orbit above our capital without authorization. Our defense forces scramble. Our council convenes in emergency session. 40 species are interrupted from their work to discuss whether to destroy you, and you are grateful. I am, I said, because the alternative to this conversation was a much less productive outcome, and I had no way of guaranteeing this conversation would happen. The fact that it is happening means someone in this council made a decision to prioritize understanding over reaction. That is worth being grateful for. A pause that stretched long enough to be deliberate. Then Aerith said, with almost no change in expression, "You are not afraid of me." It was not a question either, but this one felt different, less like a test, more like a genuine observation, and underneath it, something that might have been curiosity pressing up against the certainty. I am aware of the situation I am in, I said honestly. I am alone on your station with my ship damaged. I am not in a position of strength, I know that, but being aware of your situation and being afraid of it are two different things. I was trained to tell the difference. Something shifted in the room. I could not have pointed to what changed exactly, but the air in the space between us moved in a different way, as though the temperature of the conversation had adjusted by a single degree. Thessaly spoke then for the first time in person, and the voice matched exactly what I had heard over the comm. Quiet, patient, carrying more weight than the volume suggested. Commander Vasquez, before we proceed to the formal hearing, I would like to establish something clearly for the record. You have stated that your presence here was the result of a navigational emergency. You have offered your logs for independent review. Is that offer still open? Yes, I said. And you are willing to answer questions about your vessel and its capabilities. I thought about that for exactly the right amount of time, not too fast, which would seem careless, not too slow, which would seem evasive. I am willing to answer questions about my vessel that are relevant to the question of whether I represent a threat, I said. I will be honest about that boundary if I reach it, but I do not expect to reach it, because the honest answer to the question of whether I represent a threat is no. The Council will determine that, Aerith said. Yes, I agreed. That is why I am here. He studied me for another moment. Then he turned and walked toward the corridor that led deeper into the station. The others followed. Thessaly paused just long enough to give me a look that I could not fully read, but which contained, I thought, something that was not quite a warning and not quite reassurance. Something between the two. I followed them into the corridor. The council chamber was 3 levels up, reached by a series of lifts that moved with the kind of smooth precision that meant the engineering beneath them was very good and had been very good for a very long time. The corridor walls were lined with something that was not quite glass, through which I could see sections of the station's interior, open spaces, other corridors, rooms where I could see figures moving that were clearly not human. Different heights, different proportions, different ways of occupying space. The conclave and its day-to-day reality. I looked at all of it as I walked through it, and I filed every observation carefully, because I was very aware that I was the first human being to walk these corridors, and the weight of that was something I did not intend to carry lightly. The council chamber was large. Not enormous, not the cathedral scale I had half imagined, but a space that was designed to hold the attention of everyone inside it. Tiered seating arranged in a broad curve, each tier occupied by representatives of different species. 40, in theory. I counted quickly and reached 31 visible before I lost the thread, the rest represented by screens showing members attending remotely from home systems too distant for the emergency session to have brought them physically. Every eye, and several sensory organs that were not precisely eyes but served similar functions, turned toward me as I walked in. I had been watched before. There is a specific kind of attention you learn to carry as a naval officer, particularly in command positions. You learn that people are reading you all the time, checking for certainty, for weakness, for whether the person in charge actually believes what they are saying. This was different only in scale. The mechanism was the same. I walked to the open floor at the center of the chamber and I stopped. I did not look at any single section of the room. I let my gaze move slowly across all of them, taking in the full arc of the chamber, acknowledging without words that I saw them all, and then I stood still. The formal hearing was called to order by a neutral moderator, a species I had no file on, who spoke in a precisely measured cadence that the translation software had clearly worked with many times and rendered cleanly. The first hour was the conclave's questions. How did the unconditional achieve faster-than-light travel at the range implied by her entry point? What was the drive generation? How many vessels of this class had Earth built? What were their patrol routes? What were their weapons specifications? Were there others waiting beyond the buffer zone? Was this a test of conclave defenses? Was this a political message from the Earth government? I answered every question. Some answers were simple. Some required context. The drive generation question I handled carefully, confirming the generation number without elaborating on the specifics, which was honest without being a full technical briefing. The question about other vessels I answered directly. Yes, the Earth Navy had other Apex-class ships. No, none of them were anywhere near conclave space, and I offered to provide patrol route records from the last 6 months to confirm it. The question about whether this was a political message I answered with a slight pause and then a direct, clear, no. This was a commander who made a mathematical error under emergency conditions and ended up somewhere she had not intended to be. The question that changed the room came from a council member I had not previously tracked. A species represented in the upper tier, physical form partially obscured by the angle, whose translation came through in a slow, very deliberate cadence that suggested either extreme caution or extreme age, possibly both. Commander Vasquez, our intelligence files on human military development were last updated 6 years ago. At that time, our assessment placed Earth naval technology at Generation 4 propulsion and Generation 3 weapons systems. You have confirmed your vessel is Generation 7 propulsion. Can you explain the discrepancy? I could explain the discrepancy. The explanation was something I had not been prepared to give in a public forum, but the question had been asked in front of 31 species and 31 screens, and there was no graceful way to sidestep it. Yes, I said, I can explain it. I paused for a moment to order my thoughts. 17 years ago, Earth was in the final stages of a conflict that lasted 4 decades and cost us, in direct and indirect ways, more than we had words to fully account for at the time. I will not detail that conflict here. It is in your files, though I suspect the files are incomplete, because the full scope of what that war did to us is something we are still measuring ourselves. What matters for your question is this. When it ended, the people who had survived it made a decision. They decided that Earth would never again be in a position where survival was uncertain. They built, faster than the previous generation had built, more seriously than the previous generation had understood how to build, not because we wanted to threaten anyone, not because we had an enemy in mind, because the memory of almost losing was fresh enough to make the work feel urgent in a way that probably, from outside, looked like aggression. I looked across the chamber. It was not aggression. It was fear wearing the only face it knew how to wear. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room waiting for the next word. It was the silence of a room processing something. I let it sit. Then I said, I know that is not the answer that makes you feel safer. I know that a civilization that builds fast because it is afraid can be just as dangerous as one that builds fast because it is ambitious. I am not asking you to simply trust us. I am asking you to treat the question seriously, with the real evidence, and reach a real conclusion. That is all I have ever been asking, from the moment I opened comms above your planet. Arath's voice came from the Veth section, flat, heavy, but not quite as certain as it had been in the shuttle bay. You ask us to take your fear as justification. No, I said. I ask you to take our fear as context. The justification, if there is one, is what we chose to do with that fear. We did not cross the buffer zone. We did not make demands. We did not use the capability we built to do anything except exist and attempt to be heard. That is a choice. Every day for 16 years it has been a choice. Today it was made for me by a broken drive coil and a debris field, but the choice of what to do once I was here, that one was mine. Thessaly spoke then, quietly from the Lyrani section. I moved to extend Commander Vasquez's full hearing rights under Observer Protocol, and to table any defense action pending the completion of that hearing. The vote was called. I watched the panel. 27 in favor, 13 against. I stayed perfectly still while the numbers registered. I did not let the relief show in my face or my posture, not because I was performing composure, because this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a different and probably much longer conversation, and the way I stood in this moment was going to be part of the record of that conversation. The moderator confirmed the motion carried. The Veth section did not vote. They had abstained, which in practical terms was the same as opposition but carried a different message. A door left ajar rather than locked. I filed that away. As the session broke for a brief recess, Thessaly crossed the chamber floor toward me. The movement was slow, deliberate, the way the Lyrani seemed to do most things, and when they stopped in front of me, the dark eyes held that same reading quality I had noticed in the shuttle bay. You spoke well, they said. I spoke honestly, I said. I'm not sure those are always the same thing, but today I think they were. A pause. You are not what they said you would be. I looked at them for a moment. What did they say I would be? Thessaly considered the question. Loud, they said. Aggressive, certain of yourself in a way that left no room for others. I almost smiled. I am certain of myself, I said, but I have found it does not require much room. Something in Thessaly's expression shifted, very slightly, in a way that I thought might be the Lyrani equivalent of a smile. No, they said, I suppose it does not. The recess ended. I walked back to the center of the chamber floor. 31 species and 31 screens, and somewhere outside in orbit, my broken, stubborn, too advanced for its own good warship, holding steady exactly where I had left her. Round 2 was beginning. The afternoon session of the hearing was different from the morning. In the morning, the council had been asking questions designed to determine threat level. The questions had been fast, pointed, and aimed at the edges of what I would and would not answer, testing for the places where I stopped talking and trying to read meaning into those pauses. It was a technique I recognized. Military intelligence used the same approach. You asked what you already knew the answer to, and you watched how the subject handled the part of the truth they thought you did not have. What they had not expected was that I had almost no places where I stopped talking. In the afternoon, the questions changed. They became less about the unconditional and more about Earth. About what we had built, yes, but also about what we intended. About the observer agreement and whether Earth still considered it valid. About whether the fact of my presence here represented a desire to renegotiate our standing with the conclave. I had not planned to say yes to that. But sitting in the center of the chamber, under the attention of 31 species and 31 screens, with a Lyrani ambassador watching me from the upper tier, and a Veth High Chancellor watching me from a section that had not yet decided whether I was a problem to be managed or a problem to be ended, I found that honesty had a momentum of its own. Yes, I said, in response to the question of whether Earth sought renegotiation. Not because I was sent here to ask for it. I was not sent here for any purpose. I was sent here by a debris field and a cracked drive coil. But since I am here, and since you have given me the floor, I think it would be dishonest to pretend that the observer status has felt, from our side, like a fair description of what humanity actually is. A ripple of movement through the chamber, not hostility, interest. I continued. 16 years ago we were told we were provisionally premature, not ready. We accepted that. We signed the agreement. We stayed in our space, we maintained the buffer zone, we attended the observer sessions and we listened and we did not vote and we did not ask for more than we were given. I paused. While we were doing all of that, we also built the unconditional, not to threaten anyone, to know that if something came for us again, we would still be here to see the morning after. I looked across at Aerith. Chancellor, I know what your position is. I heard it clearly this morning. You believe the fact of this ship's existence is itself a provocation, regardless of intent. I want to respond to that directly. He watched me. You are not wrong that capability can function as a message, I said. A warship above a capital planet communicates something whether it intends to or not. I accept that. But I would ask you to consider what the alternative would have required. We could have stayed at Generation 4, Generation 5. We could have remained exactly as dependent on our own vulnerability as we were 40 years ago when something nearly finished us. We chose not to. And in 16 years of building what we built, we have never once used it against anyone in this network. A pause. That is not nothing. The chamber held its silence. Then a voice I had not heard before, from a section I could not easily see, spoke in a register that was lower than most of the others and carried a quality that even through the translation felt very old. Commander Vasquez, I am the representative of the Orin Collective. We have been part of this conclave for 900 of your years. In that time, we have seen 32 species reach the threshold moment your civilization is currently approaching. The moment when capability outgrows recognized status. When what a people can do and what they are officially acknowledged to be become two different things. I listened carefully. Of those 32, 21 negotiated their transition peacefully. 11 did not. The difference in every case was not the level of capability. It was whether the transition was treated as a threat or as an inevitability. If you treat the inevitable as a threat, you accelerate the very outcome you fear. If you treat it as an inevitability, you give it space to resolve itself without damage. A pause. I am not making a motion. I am offering context, the kind of context that 900 years tends to produce. The Orin representative fell silent. The room absorbed what had been said. Arath's voice came again, still heavy, still carrying that quality of deep, embedded certainty, but there was something different in it now, not capitulation, something more like a person who had been handed a tool they were not sure they wanted to use but could not honestly put down. The buffer agreement specifies conditions under which renegotiation may be requested. Those conditions include a demonstration of technological development sufficient to alter the original terms. The Council cannot pretend today has not occurred. The question before us is not whether conditions for renegotiation have been met. They clearly have been. A pause. The question is whether we engage with that reality constructively or combatively. It was the most honest thing he had said since the shuttle bay. I did not let my expression change, but something in me registered it clearly. Thessaly spoke again. I moved to formally acknowledge the changed conditions under Observer Protocol Article 14 and to open a renegotiation calendar with the Earth Diplomatic Corps. I further move that this motion be noted in the record as having been initiated in direct response to this hearing. The vote was called. 20 in favor. 20 against. A tie. The VETH section had voted this time, against. The moderator confirmed the result. The motion failed. The room did not erupt. It absorbed the outcome in the way that rooms full of people who have been doing politics for a very long time absorb outcomes they expected, with a kind of weighted stillness. I stood in the center of the chamber, and I did not let the result show in my posture. A tie meant no, but a tie also meant that the room was split exactly in half, and a room that was split exactly in half was not a room that had closed a door. It was a room that had left a door exactly halfway open. The moderator called the session to a close for the day, nodding that the hearing would continue the following morning. As the chamber began to empty, Thessaly crossed the floor again. They moved with that characteristic Lyrani deliberateness, and they stopped beside me without any preamble. 20-20, they said. I heard. 3 months ago that vote would have been 6 in favor and 34 against. They paused. I want you to understand what today moved. I looked at them. You were at the debate session, I said. It was not a question. I helped build the argument. A pause. As did you without knowing it. The fact that you stood in front of this council alone, without weapons, without aggression, without anything except your own voice and your ship's sensor logs, and you answered every question honestly, that is what moved 20 votes. It only needed to move 21, I said. Yes, it did. Thessaly looked at me with that reading quality, the deep and patient attention. The Oran representative has not spoken publicly in 4 years. When they speak, others listen. Today's record will travel. I considered that. Will it be enough? I do not know, Thessaly said, but I know it will not disappear. I nodded slowly. Outside the chamber, I could feel the station around me. The weight of it. The history of 900 years of Oran membership, and whatever centuries the other 39 species had added to the total. The cumulative gravity of everything the conclave was. Thank you, I said to Thessaly, for the channel you opened before the hearing, for the motion today, for staying when others did not. Thessaly tilted their head slightly. Thank you for not running. They turned and walked back toward the Lyrani section, where several other members were waiting. I watched them go, and then I turned and walked back toward the shuttle bay. The corridor felt different going back than it had going in. The same materials, the same light, the same figures moving in the spaces beyond the almost glass walls. But I had been in that chamber, and I had stood on that floor, and 20 species had voted to begin a new conversation, and that number had not existed this morning. I recorded the log entry in my head as I walked, the way I often did when there was no recorder handy. 20-20. The Veth voted against. The Oran spoke for the first time in 4 years. Thessaly moved twice. The hearing continues tomorrow. The unconditional was holding steady in orbit when I returned to her. Arya confirmed shields at 51%, drive coil still cracked, weapons still offline. I sat in the pilot seat, and I looked at Orth Prime in the dark. Log entry, I said, activating the recorder. Day 2 in orbit above the conclave capital. Today I walked into the most important room I have ever entered, and I told them the truth. I told them we built fast because we were afraid. I told them capability without aggression is still a choice. I told them a tie vote is not a closed door. I paused. I believe all of it. Another pause. Tomorrow the hearing continues. There are 13 votes somewhere in that room that I have not reached yet. I am going to go to sleep now, and in the morning I am going to go back in there and try to reach them. I turned off the recorder. Outside, the planet turned slowly in its orbit, patient and unchanged. The same way it had been turning for longer than humanity had been standing upright and asking questions about the stars. I closed my eyes. The last morning of the hearing began differently from the others. When I arrived at Station 1 and was escorted to the council chamber, the room was not arranged the way it had been the 2 previous sessions. The tiered seating was the same. The screens showing remote members were the same, but the empty floor space at the center, where I had been standing alone for 2 days, now had a single additional chair placed in it. Not for me. My position at the center of the floor had not changed. The chair was for a different speaker. I did not ask who it was for. I took my position and I waited. The moderator called the session to order. The formal record was updated. The previous day's results were noted. And then the moderator announced that before the day's questions resumed, the VETH delegation had requested time to address the full council. Arath descended from the VETH section. He was, close up and in full lighting, exactly as physically imposing as the intelligence files had suggested. He moved with the particular economy of motion of someone who had never needed to perform strength because it had simply always been available to them. He sat in the chair that had been placed on the floor, and for a moment he did not speak. He looked at me. I looked back. Then he spoke, not to me, to the chamber. The VETH delegation has been in discussion since yesterday's session concluded. We have reviewed the full record of this hearing. We have reviewed our own intelligence files. We have reviewed the statement of the Orin Collective and the voting record and the facts of this case as they have been established over the past 2 days. A pause. We maintain our position that the unauthorized presence of a human warship above Orith Prime represents a breach that cannot be treated as trivial and cannot be absorbed into existing protocol without acknowledgement. We do not withdraw that position. Another pause, longer. However, the Orin Collective has been part of this council for 900 years. When they speak of the 32 threshold moments they have witnessed, they speak from a record we do not have. The VETH have been part of this council for 240 years. We have seen 8 threshold moments in that time. Of the 8, the 5 we treated as threats are the 5 that resolved with damage. The 3 we treated as inevitable resolved without. The chamber was very quiet. We are not prepared to vote in favor of an upgraded status today. We are not prepared to support the renegotiation motion as it was presented. What we are prepared to do is abstain from opposition to a modified motion, one that acknowledges the changed conditions without conferring new status, and which opens a formal diplomatic channel between the Conclave and Earth to begin a negotiation process on a defined timeline. He looked at me directly. This is not trust. This is arithmetic. The Orin Collective is correct that treating the inevitable as a threat accelerates the worst outcomes. The VETH have spent 240 years trying to make good decisions. That is what this is. He stood, walked back to the VETH section. I stood at the center of the floor in the silence that followed, and I did not let anything show in my face or my posture. But inside, I was running the numbers very fast, because the numbers had changed significantly in the last 4 minutes. Thessaly moved the modified motion. The vote was called. 31 in favor, 9 against. The 9 were a cluster of smaller council members whose opposition was noted in the record, and whose positions I did not have enough information to fully analyze, but who represented, in this moment, a minority that had not managed to hold the room. The modified motion carried. The moderator confirmed it. Formal diplomatic channel to be opened. Earth to be notified through official channels. a defined negotiation timeline to be established within 60 days. I stood on the floor of the Galactic Conclave chamber, and I kept my expression exactly level while around me, the most significant shift in humanity's political status, since the Observer Agreement of 16 years ago was recorded into the formal record. Then the session was called to close. As the chamber emptied for the last time, Aerith walked past me without stopping. He did not look at me. He did not speak. But as he passed, he gave a single, very small nod. Not acknowledgement of me as a threat, not capitulation. Recognition, one professional to another. I received it. Thessaly was the last to leave, as they had been each day. And as they had been each day, they crossed the floor to speak before going. "It is done," they said. "The beginning of it is done," I said. "The rest is going to take a long time." Yes, a pause. Are you ready for that? I thought about it honestly. Earth will send better negotiators than me, I said. Diplomats who trained for this. People who know the rules of this room better than I do. That is not what I asked. I looked at Thessaly. Yes, I said, I am ready, whatever that means for someone who came here by accident. Thessaly's expression shifted again, in that small way that I had learned to read as something close to warmth. Most important arrivals, they said, are accidents. I returned to the unconditional in the late afternoon, by the station's clock. Arya had continued repairs during my absence. Shields were at 68%. Drive coil was still cracked, but Arya had calculated a safe limited-range jump was possible. The weapons were still offline, and I found I was no longer thinking about them very much. I sat in the pilot seat, and I did not start the jump calculations immediately. I looked at Orith Prime for a while. The planet that had been turning in the dark for longer than my species had been asking questions, and which would keep turning long after the questions we asked today were answered and replaced by new ones. I thought about the 31 votes. I thought about the Orin Collective speaking for the first time in 4 years. I thought about Aerith's nod and what it had cost him to give it. I thought about Thessaly standing still at the edge of the chamber each day, waiting for the room to empty, staying because staying was the kind of decision they had made a long time ago and saw no reason to unmake. I activated my personal log. Final entry from Orith Prime. The hearing is concluded. A formal diplomatic channel has been established between the Galactic Conclave and Earth. I did not come here to open it. I came here because my math was wrong and my drive coil gave out, and a debris field near Kepler's Veil had no patience for careful navigation. But I am here, and the channel is open, and whatever happens next in that room will happen because 31 species decided it was worth finding out. I paused. I have been thinking about what Thessaly said, that the Conclave feared humanity because they measured us by what we could destroy. They had not yet learned to measure us by what we choose not to. Another pause. I want to believe that is what happened here, that the choice not to fight, not to threaten, not to perform strength in a room full of species that were waiting for exactly that performance, that the choice to simply stand still and speak honestly was what moved 20, and then 31 votes. I looked at the planet one more time. I know it is not that simple. I know the Veth abstained because of arithmetic, not because they changed their minds about us. I know 9 species voted no and will keep voting no for a long time. I know the negotiation ahead is going to be difficult and long and full of moments where arithmetic and honesty are not going to be enough, and where we will need things I cannot provide from the pilot seat of a warship. I sat back. But today in this room, with a cracked drive coil and no weapons and one very patient Lyrani ambassador and 900 years of Orin memory, today it was enough. I reached for the navigation controls. Arya, plot a course for Earth. Easy jump. We are in no hurry. Plotted, Commander. And Arya, open a full-spectrum broadcast on all Conclave monitoring frequencies. Open, Commander. I sat up straight. I adjusted my collar. I looked out at the planet and the ring of stations and the 53 ships that had held their positions for 2 days watching me, and I pressed the broadcast key. This is Commander Yara Vasquez of the UES Unconditional, departing Orth Prime. We came here by accident and we leave by choice. To the 31 who voted today, we will not forget it. To the 9 who did not, we will keep working on it. To the 900 years of Orin memory, and the 240 years of Veth arithmetic, and the quiet patience of a Lyrani ambassador who stayed when the room emptied, thank you. I paused. To anyone else watching, any monitoring station, any research post, any vessel running silent on the edges of this system who has been watching these 2 days unfold and wondering what it means we are here, not as a threat, not as a problem to be solved, as neighbors who are still learning how to introduce themselves. A final pause. We will meet properly soon. I am looking forward to it. I released the broadcast key. The drives hummed to life beneath me, steady and warm, carrying 3 years of deep space patrol and 1 accidental history-making through the calculations Arya had prepared. The jump took 4 seconds. When I came out the other side, Orth Prime was gone. What was ahead was home, and the very long conversation that was going to have to begin there before the 60-day timeline ran out, and the diplomats who were better at this than I was, who would walk into a room I had prepared for them without knowing I was doing it, and who would carry forward something I had started with a broken drive coil and a debris field, and the decision to straighten my collar before I opened a channel. I turned off the broadcast system. I turned off the tactical display. I left the navigation and the sensors running, and I leaned back in my seat and I breathed out slowly, all the way, for what felt like the first time in 3 days. Log closed, I said. Vasquez, Commander, UES Unconditional. A pause. Navigation error logged. Mission status unplanned. Outcome better than expected. Outside the viewport, the stars streamed past in long lines as the ship moved through space at speed, each one a point of light that had been burning in the dark long before anyone had looked up and decided to go find out what was out there. We had been deciding that for a very long time, and every time we did, something happened that nobody had quite expected. That, I thought, was probably the most human thing about us. Not the ships, not the speed, not the drives or the weapons or the generations of hard-learned engineering. The fact that we kept looking up. The fact that even when we landed somewhere unexpected, we stood still and straightened our collars and decided to see what came next. The Unconditional moved through the dark toward Earth, and I sat in her pilot seat, and I watched the stars go by. We were going home. And behind us, turning slowly in its orbit, Orth Prime kept its lights burning across 3 continents, the way it had for longer than anyone aboard any ship in that system could remember. The way it would, long after all of us were done with our questions, and the next generation had picked up the ones we left behind.